Just recently, we were so fortunate to be able to test the Canon R5C for one day. And this camera was still a pre-production model provided to us by Canon Austria and our friends at Digital Store Vienna, where we get all of our gear. So big shout out to them. With that limited time, we wanted to get a couple of tests that I'm most interested in. That is the battery life, the different kind of codecs, how the camera feels, but most importantly, the dynamic range. So we went out and we pinned all of these cameras against each other. The Canon C70 shot in C-Log 2, the R5C in RAW and XFAVC, as well as the Canon R5. And we wanted to test out which camera has the better dynamic range and if we can really see a difference. Our findings after the intro. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Pixels. Here's a small disclaimer, this is not a scientific test. We just went out with a couple cameras, we had a limited amount of time, so we just basically had them side by side, or we just took the same camera and always switched the lens and the ND filters to get the same kind of look on all of these cameras. But again, it's nothing scientific. We shot different kind of scenarios that I could see myself using this camera in a real life scenario, and well, we just looked at the results. Because I feel dynamic range tests are really hard to do, so let me know down in the comments below how you would want me to test dynamic range once I finally get my production model. To make these tests as similar as possible, we used the Canon 16-35 on all of these cameras. And although the C70 has internal ND filters, we wanted to use the same ND filters for all of the cameras to eliminate some color shifts. So we used our matte box on all of these lenses and didn't use the internal ND filters on the Canon C70. Our first test was really simple. I just took the C70 as well as the R5C, pointed it towards a landscape with the sun setting in the background, and that was pretty much it. The C70 was set to XFAVC, C-Log 2 Cinema Gamut, and I shot on raw light on the R5C. For all of these tests, whenever I'm using the R5C in raw light, I'm using C-Log 2 to convert it back to Rec 709 because that should give us the most dynamic range. If I had to make some adjustments to get the highlights back in place, pulled the shadows down, but that is pretty much all I did. Maybe I raised the saturation on one or two shots, but I didn't do any kind of color grading extensively on any of these shots. And here, I honestly couldn't really see a difference between the dynamic range of the two cameras. There were some slight color tone differences as well as some saturation differences in both cameras, but for the dynamic range, they were pretty much the same by just looking at the footage. All of the shots you see in this video are not color graded. They're all just color corrected to get them back to Rec 709. And I used the Canon C-Log 2 and C-Log 3 LUTs to Rec 709 that are available on the Canon website for it. In our second test, we pinned the C70 against the R5C again, but this time we shot XFAVC and MP4 on both cameras. And here I just exposed for Franco skin tone with the sun setting on the building behind him. And here I was really surprised, because yet again, I couldn't really see a difference. I think both look absolutely amazing, and when it comes to dynamic range, I really couldn't tell which camera was which. And this would be a typical scenario where I could see myself using this camera in. Just shooting outdoors with a sunset and not wanting to have my highlights blown out in the background. And here, well again, both cameras pretty much look the same to me. For our next test, we added the R5 to the mix. So we had Bell stand in front of the camera with the sun being behind the camera, and then we shot it on the Canon C70 in XFAVC, the R5 in C-Log 3, as well as the R5C, once in RAW and once in XFAVC. And here, again, I was surprised at how close all of these were together. Again, we were using the same lens with the same matte box, so we didn't literally have the cameras side by side because of the whole ND filter situation. So these videos are a little bit apart. So the sun could have changed and reflected off of a back window a little bit more in one shot than the other, but it was a clear sky and there were no clouds in the back. That would have actually influenced the shot by much. Overall, I would say that the R5 has the least dynamic range. And one more thing that I could tell is that there's also more noise in the shadows. And that was the R5 shooting in MP4, not in Canon RAW. One thing that was really surprising to me is that the Canon R5C in Canon RAW Light versus the XFAVC looked also really similar, and that is despite us shooting in RAW on the R5C, so we were able to capture it in C-Log 2, whereas we had to use C-Log 3 on the R5C when shooting an XF-AVC. When looking at the waveforms from the log footage, we can see that in theory the Canon RAW light on the R5C has a bit more dynamic range, because we can see that there's a bit more latitude in the shadows compared to the C-Log3. But overall, when just color correcting the footage back to Rec. 709, I could virtually see no difference. The Canon C70 also looked really nice and pleasing to us, whereas the R5 looked kind of weird. It looked really video-y, so the highlight roll-off of the R5 was definitely not as good as on the C70 as well as on the R5C. So here I think I could see a difference between the R5 and the other two cameras. And this has nothing to do with dynamic range, but looking at the R5 footage, I also thought that the colors looked a little off compared to the R5C and the C70. The colors on both of these cameras were pretty much identical, whereas the R5 had a bit of a magenta tint to it, and well, me personally, I didn't really like that too much. Afterwards, we did the same test, but in the other direction. Now we had the sun in the background, and here I had pretty much the same findings. The R5 had way more noise in the shadows, and it overall didn't look as pleasing. For some reason, I didn't get the whole image circle right, and the R5 is a little bit more zoomed in, and that could be also the reason why I have more pronounced and less details in the shadows. But overall, I could definitely see that the R5 had the least dynamic range, and the shadows were a little more crushed than on the other two cameras. As for the C70 versus the R5C, again, I couldn't really see a difference. When looking at the waveforms though, then it's clearly shown that the C70 has more dynamic range. All of the other cameras shooting in RAW as well as an XF-AVC or the MP4 in the R5, you can see that the shadows are a little crushed and there's not that much detail left. So here again, the C70 and the R5C look virtually identical and both look great, whereas the R5 looked a little bit off and a little bit more like a video camera instead of a cinema camera, if that makes sense. But overall, I really like the image coming out of these cameras, and in a real world scenario, if that is one, then I think that the dynamic range of these two were really close together. For our last test, I did an underexposure test between the C70 and the R5C, because this is something that I could also see myself using in a real world scenario, whereas I don't want to clip the highlights in a sunset, for example, so I'm exposing for the highlights and therefore have my subject severely underexposed. Then I'm trying to bring all of this back up, and here we pinned the C70 against the R5C in RAW and in XF-AVC. And none of these two cameras did an amazing job of bringing back the shadows in the detail, but there wasn't really a clear winner between the two either. And also again, I couldn't really tell a difference between the RAW and the internal XF-AVC. It might make a difference for someone that is way more experienced in color grading, a professional colorist, but for me and the way that I shoot with the camera and also correct it and grade it in post, I really couldn't take advantage of that RAW format, and therefore I would probably not shoot with it at all. So what is my first look and verdict of these three cameras side by side? I do think that I can see a difference between the R5 and the C70 as well as the R5C. But when it comes to the C70 versus the R5C in this really limited run and gun scenario, I couldn't really tell a difference, and that was to my utter surprise, because I thought that sometimes maybe the R5C would clip in the highlights whereas the C70 would retain them, and when pulling back the shadows I would get more information in the shadows on the C70 opposed to the R5C. But in my opinion, I didn't. So that was something that I was really surprised about. So this was a really limited test and more of a first look to what these cameras can do side by side. And I will do more intense testing once I get my production model, hopefully by the end of the month. So make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be the first to know when these videos will drop. And if you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up, because it really helps the channel grow. And I hope to see you on the next one.